We are with Art Chang. Art was described as a tech entrepreneur, occasional public sector troubleshooter, did some pivotal work for the New York City Campaign Finance Board. And now that was his description by Streets Blog, New York. And Art is now candidate for mayor of the city of New York. Welcome, Art. How are you?
I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you for being up so late.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for staying up late and staying with us. I mean, look, it's New York. It's still pretty early, right?
Absolutely.
Hey, Art, you were one of only a few candidates who fearlessly rode with Dave Cologne. And if you don't know, folks in the audience, Dave is one of the staff writers at Streets Blog, New York. So did Dave treat you well? How was that?
That was fantastic. It was a fantastic ride. You know, I love riding a bike, and I love riding with someone who is as passionate about bikes as Dave is. So he tried to throw some hard questions at me, but you know, I think we ended up having a great conversation. I think I ended up surprising him in a couple of places.
Oh, cool. Where did you guys go?
We met up in Prospect Heights, near where I live. And then we rode down to Red Hook, and we rode along the waterfront, and then kind of looped back up through, through Carroll Gardens, and then back up into Park Slope, and then back here. It's a great ride.
So you were on, streets with good bike lanes, streets with bad bike lanes, streets with really good separated paths, and streets.
Yep, and then we also had to cross under the BQE overpass.
Yes, of course.
And riding in the left turn lane for the cars.
So you may be our only candidate who speaks of doing laps in Prospect. Just give us a few more sentences or a little bigger picture of Art Chang, the city bike rider.
I prefer to ride the bike whenever I can. Obviously, when the weather's bad, or if I'm going to work and I have to wear nice clothes, I don't ride it as much. But I ride it everywhere around my neighborhood that I possibly can. I'm usually late for everything, and so hopping on the bike is the fastest way to get there. So it's basically I go to Prospect Park to go play tennis, to ride around the park, enjoy the things. I'm also a member of the Park Slope Food Co-op. And so I found one of the most efficient ways for me to actually get my groceries is to ride down there, put a couple panniers on my bike, right, and then use the gears on my bike to make that trip back home easier.
So the city's been doing, a lot more bike lanes in, the recent last decade or more. But a lot of them still look like my sort of images here behind me, which are protected bike lanes, but they still have cars and trucks all over them.
Right.
What's your sort of point of view on that, as someone who rides a bike, but then, what are you going to do about it when you're the mayor?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I can't stand it when people are parking in the bike lanes, and I'm especially troubled when municipal vehicles, including police cars, are parked in our bike lanes, because we figure if we're going to show respect for bicyclists, the first people to do so should be the folks who drive the cars that are owned by the city. And so it's a big problem. We also have a huge problem because of COVID, right? Because of the people not willing to take the subway, we now have this huge explosion of car ownership in the city, which in some respects is, I'm sorry?
But also bike use.
Yes, and also bike use, right? And it's astonishing that kind of combination hasn't resulted in more fatalities, but it's been very, very interesting. We obviously need to do something serious. I mean, New York City cannot be a world-class city without a really robust bike infrastructure. As we know, the mayor had proposed, the Green Wave plan, which a number of us, including myself, thought was like far too small and not sufficient. And then the whole process of how you just made decisions, and that made it seem like it was unlikely to move at any kind of real pace. And we've seen that in some places in the city, bike lanes taking as long as a decade to really be implemented.
Right.
Corey Johnson's, street master plan was a huge improvement, huge. It's really too bad that COVID, derailed that. But that was really clearly going in the right direction in terms of ambition and speed. And then, I've just been a huge fan of the Regional Plan Association's 5-borough bikeway plan, because that starts to get at something which is truly comprehensive, that really thinks holistically about how bike lanes can intersect throughout the city. It addresses issues like the intersections and how we manage sort of the bike car interface. So I think those things are all fantastic. But what I really want to kind of think about and look at like the Municipal Art Society's Fight for Light plan is that it's the biking is also part of the overall streetscape, right? And we know that streets are actually public spaces and they're urban spaces. And we've certainly seen it in COVID with restaurants on the street now and things that are far, far broader, right? So now we have retail. We know retail is part of the street. We know bikes are part of the street. We have new micromodal transportation. We have to have deliveries. And then we have to have safety for everybody. So it's a very complex mix. And, bikes, I think, really have to come first as a driver, but there are many other things to consider as well.
But what do you do then as mayor to sort of knock all that together and make it work?
One thing, we have to stop this sort of fragmented, siloed approach that the city takes, where every agency goes within its own silo, and then the agencies within the agencies have their own silos, and nobody's really coordinated. So I'm really in favor of proposals like the Director of the Public Realm kind of proposals, where you have, a single person who has a staff that is tasked with coordinating all the activities between these different agencies. And, because that's actually true. It's actually a great microcosm and a great analog for what has to happen across the city in so many areas. None of our problems are actually really isolated. And if we deal with them in a fragmentary way, which is the way things have been done for the past 8 years, we're not actually going to be able to make progress. So we have to look at these things intersectionally, because that's really where the interest is going to come from. And that's really how we're going to drive solutions.
Cool. So, you're talking about streets as public space, which represents pretty big change. And despite some of the rhetoric we've been getting for years, it's still kind of like, let's move some cars here. And what do you see? And you mentioned the street master plan. What is your sort of view of the public process for making this work? Because people talk about achieving consensus, but look, it's 8.4 million people. You're not going to get consensus. At some point, you have to act. So how do you view it? Is it, trench warfare at the community board plus, something, or is it, do you change it up?
You have to change it up, because what we're doing is not a community board by community board basis, because that's actually very fragmentary again. We actually want to do this the right way. You have to look at things holistically, which means looking at the entire city. So one of the problems with the Green Wave plan was that it followed the same old process of leaving it up to each community board to figure out what was going on. And I think that the real innovation in the Streets Master Plan was that this would be a program that would be adopted across the city, and it would bypass the community boards.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the community boards would have something to say about it, but and it's not spelled out necessarily, but it is. I would expect that they would be given a lot of input and forums and stuff, but they wouldn't get to say no, and that's a big change from today.
That's right. That's right. But they should be able to influence like how things happen and kind of go around the edges of it, because it is part of an overall plan. So if you look at the bike as a piece of it, and then there's so much else surrounding the bike lane within that community board that really could merit a lot of improvement and discussion.
So you mentioned being on with Dave some of the segments of the waterfront greenway, like Van Brunt or maybe Columbia Street. What's your view on, if you look at some of our global peers who are also coming late to cycling, they're not like Amsterdam or Copenhagen, they're Paris and London. They're actually building stuff in real infrastructure. They're using stone and concrete and steel.
Right.
And some of us, we like the paint because it's fast, but we never come back to do the slower part. But Paris and London are doing real infrastructure fairly quickly, like within a few years. And it's taking us, like, I'm sure you've witnessed the Flushing Avenue bike path, and that's
incredible. Yeah.
Been under the knife for like 10 years, and in the planning work for longer. So what are you going to do to give us sort of more of that physical infrastructure?
Well, it's going to take capital for one thing. But I think there's actually a behavioral piece of this. Europe has had a much longer history of bike culture. And so
Well, Paris and London were hellholes for bikes not that long ago.
Is that right? I mean,
Yeah.
like 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, no, not even. I mean, 10 years they've been doing some work, but it's more like on our pace. Like, we started doing protected bike lanes in 2007. They were a few years ahead of us, but not that much. And
No, that's interesting.
the
Yeah,
previous mayor for London.
I didn't realize that the timing was that short.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this has to do with, the degree to which we invest in things, because we're not a society that spends a huge amount of capital making significant investments in things like bikeways. And so that's going to require a very significant mindset. There's so many issues that we're going to have to allocate costs across. And I'll just give you one example in the streets is that, we have all these combined sewers that run under the streets that, dump 40% of our raw sewage out into New York Harbor when it rains heavily. And so we look at some of these capital costs and we're going to have to really make some really, really hard decisions. Now, bike lanes are going to be a lot faster to deliver than separating out the storm overflows. But, it is something that the people are going to have to fix, like look at and go, yes, we really want this and we're going to want to invest in it. And this is going to be better for everybody. I think the way to get there is not to focus just on the bike lanes, but it's actually to focus on the entire street. Because if we make the street better, if we can calm traffic and start thinking about moving to a car-free street, thinking about how we populate the street and regain that public space, then I think the investment in the bike lane becomes one piece of a much larger, much more holistic thing.
Art, I apologize that we have kind of a short window here just because it's getting later, but is there anything else about your candidacy, your campaign, and bikes in the city that you want to get across to us?
What I want to say is, so biking, I've been biking in New York since I moved here in 1985. I've been doored. I know what that's like. It's not a very pleasant experience. I put my kids on bikes. I've been biking all around. So bikes are really important to my life and to my experience in New York City. When visitors come, it is really the way that I take them around and show them around. But I think what I want to just convey to people is that I bring an outsider's perspective along with an insider's experience. And I've been hands-on doing and problem solving for 35 years of doing work in New York City, including 30 years in government and 30 years in a parallel life in the private sector. And I really think that, New York really needs kind of a broad set of experiences and skill sets to really take us into the next generation. And that includes things like making streets great for bikes.
Fantastic. Art, thank you for being with us.
Great. Thank you so much.
Art's website is behind him, and we'll see you on the street. We'll see you in the campaign.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Art.